Night had fallen early along the Alaskan coast. Clouds pressed low against the spruce-lined cliffs, and the wind carried the sharp smell of rain and salt. Ethan Carter adjusted the strap of his camera pack, the sound of his boots drowned by the roar of the tide. He had come here chasing a rumor that wolves on this coast fished for salmon like bears. No one in his department believed it. He just wanted proof. Lightning flashed, turning the river silver for an instant. Then the world shifted. His next step found no ground. The wet stones slid beneath him, and suddenly the current seized his legs, pulling him downstream. The shock of the cold hit like a wall. Ethan gasped, salt silt and panic flooding his throat. He tried to swim, but the current spun him, hurling him toward a fallen cedar. The camera pack dragged him lower. He kicked free, surfaced once, shouted, but the sea answered with thunder. Then, through the blur of rain, he saw them. At the bend of the river, a shape moved against the current, lean, gray, alive. A wolf, no smaller. A wolf pup, its fur slick with rain, standing on a rock, jutting from the foam. Amber eyes locked on him. The pup barked sharp and urgent. From the forest came a reply, deep, resonant howls that rolled through the storm like drums. Ethan's body was giving up. He felt the pull of the undertow dragging him under again. Just before the darkness closed, movement tore through the waves. 3 wolves. They plunged into the shallows, muscles straining, fighting the current. One gripped his sleeve, another braced its body against his shoulder. The third steadied the pup on the rock. Together they dragged him toward shore, step by step, until his back met sand and roots. He coughed, choking out river water blinking up through rain. For a heartbeat, he thought he was hallucinating a circle of gray silhouettes, eyes glinting in flashes of lightning. The wolf pup crept closer, sniffed his hand, then backed away as the largest wolf gave a low rumble. And then silence. The pack vanished into the mist, leaving only paw prints that filled slowly with rain. Ethan lay there shaking, trying to understand what had just happened. His rational mind, the scientist, scrambled for explanation. Wolves don't pull drowning men from rivers. They don't coordinate rescues. And yet, he was alive. The pup's paw prints led back toward the forest alongside larger ones that curved upriver. Somewhere in the distance, a lone howl rose and faded. He whispered into the storm, half dazed, half grateful. "You just saved me." The surf answered with a crash. As the tide crept higher, Ethan gathered his strength and crawled toward the tree line, following the fading tracks. Beyond the pines, a faint glow flickered, not firelight, but the reflection of the moon on water. The same river that had nearly taken his life now shimmered like a living thing. Somewhere out there, the wolves were moving, intelligent, deliberate, almost human in their rhythm. And in that moment, Ethan Carter, a man of science, felt something he hadn't in years: awe. He didn't know it yet, but the night he almost died would become the night that changed everything we thought we knew about wolves. Ethan Carter had always believed that the world revealed its secrets only to those who were willing to stay long enough to listen. At 29, he was one of the youngest field biologists in the Northwest Conservation Program, restless, brilliant, and sometimes too stubborn for his own safety. His colleagues called him the kid who chased ghosts, rumors of animals that weren't supposed to exist. 2 weeks before the accident, he'd landed in Juneau with a pack of recording gear, camera traps, and a single hypothesis that the coastal wolves of Alaska had adapted to the rhythms of the tide, learning to hunt fish the way grizzlies did. Most scientists dismissed it as folklore from fishermen, exaggerated campfire tales of fishing wolves. But Ethan wanted to see for himself. He drove north through endless rain and fog until the road ended at a fishing village called Yakutat. From there, only boat and boot could take him farther into the old-growth wilderness where the Pacific met the mountains. The landscape seemed carved from another century. Spruce trees rose like green cathedrals. Moss hung from branches like torn silk. rivers cut through stone cold and clear, feeding into the sea. And somewhere between those rivers and the cliffs lived the coastal wolf packs, gray phantoms of the shoreline. Ethan set up his base near a small river delta, a place locals called the Singing Water. Each morning he recorded tracks along the sand bear prints, otter slides, and occasionally the unmistakable oval of a wolf's paw pressed beside fish scales. It was proof, faint but real. At night, he sat by the camp stove writing in his journal by headlamp. "Wolves are not confined by what we think they should be," he wrote. "They adapt. They invent. The line between instinct and intelligence is thinner than we admit." He thought of the first time he'd heard wolves howl as a boy in Montana, a sound that felt less like a threat and more like a question. Maybe that's what brought him here, the desire to answer it. The days blurred into a rhythm of rain and tide. He tracked the movements of salmon runs, set cameras near eddies where the fish rested, and sometimes caught glimpses of motion among the trees, a flash of gray fur, a shape vanishing between roots. Locals told him stories. A fisherman swore he'd seen a wolf standing in the surf, snatching salmon mid-leap. A logger claimed the wolves buried fish like food caches for winter. Ethan listened, never laughing. "My job," he said, "isn't to doubt or believe, it's to record." Still, there was one rule everyone repeated. Don't follow them too close. Wolves near the coast aren't afraid of people, but they're not tame either. He respected that, at least at first. By the end of his second week, he had hours of empty footage, only gulls and wind. Frustration crept in. His funding would run out soon, and the university expected results. On the morning of the storm, he decided to hike upriver alone beyond his permitted zone, where satellite maps showed a deeper pool. If wolves fish anywhere, he told himself, it will be there. He left before dawn, gray light stretching across the estuary. The air smelled of wet cedar and salt. In his field recorder, he noted tide low. Salmon run increasing, evidence of tracks near waterline. Those were the last words he spoke before the slip, the fall, the current that nearly claimed him. When he awoke after the rescue, bruised and trembling, the reality of what had happened refused to make sense. Wolves had pulled him from a freezing river, or at least that's what his memory insisted. But adrenaline and shock can play tricks. Back at base camp the next morning, he found his drone missing gear scattered by the flood. Only one thing remained untouched, his waterproof notebook washed up beside the fire pit. The page still legible read, Observation No. 12. Coastal wolves may respond to human distress calls, test unknown. He laughed, then stopped, realizing it wasn't funny. If the wolves had truly helped him, it meant something extraordinary, cooperation across species, unprompted and deliberate. If he'd imagined it, it meant exhaustion had finally broken his mind. Either way, he couldn't walk away now. So when dawn painted the sky pale gold, Ethan packed light, slung his camera, and followed the same river back toward the forest. The tide was out, leaving behind silvered stones and the smell of kelp. The world felt reset, as if daring him to look closer. Every scientist has a moment when data turns into story, when you stop measuring the wild and it starts measuring you. He didn't know what waited beyond that bend in the river, only that the answer would rewrite everything he thought he knew about wolves and maybe about himself. The second dawn after the storm came, washed in fog. The forest dripped with the sound of renewal drops from the cedar needles, the hush of distant surf, and somewhere unseen, the hollow rhythm of paws against wet earth. Ethan Carter followed the river upstream. Camera, ready breath, frosting in the cold. The air was so still he could hear his own heartbeat. Then he saw them. Not shadows, not illusions. Real. A pack of coastal wolves, 5 in total, standing on the gravel bar where the salmon pooled. The alpha female, silver-gray, with darker bands across her back, watched the current like a hunter studying a map. Two juveniles flanked her, their fur patchy from the rain, and behind them, half hidden by driftwood, was the wolf pup. The same pup. Its left hind leg carried a faint scrape, a shallow wound that had scabbed but not healed. Ethan felt a pulse of recognition and disbelief. He whispered, "You really exist." The wolves moved with the tide, not against it. When a salmon leapt, one snapped its jaws sideways, catching the fish mid-arc, tossing it onto the stones. Another used its paw, a deliberate, precise swipe, to pin the flopping fish long enough to bite through the gills. The pup tried, too clumsy, but determined. It slipped, splashed, and barked in frustration. The adults ignored the noise, focused entirely on the rhythm of the water. Ethan crouched behind a fallen log, barely daring to breathe. Every instinct screamed to record, but part of him feared the click of his shutter might shatter the miracle. He pressed the button anyway. The lens captured what no one had believed: wolves fishing, not scavenging, not by accident, but with method and cooperation. Then the pup noticed him. Amber eyes met human blue through the veil of mist. For a long second, neither moved. The pup tilted its head, ears, twitching, curiosity outweighing fear. Ethan froze, his pulse hammering. He whispered softly, "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The alpha turned, her gaze locked on his, not aggression assessment. She stepped forward, tail level, head high. Ethan felt small, irrelevant, yet oddly calm. He lowered his camera hands, open, body still. The wolf sniffed the air, then gave a quiet huff and looked back toward the river. Whatever decision she made, it spared him. She returned to fishing. Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Hours passed. The pack fed until the light softened toward evening. The pup dragged its half-eaten salmon toward a flat rock and gnawed at the tail. Ethan's scientific mind ran wild. This was tool use, planning, teaching behavior. But what moved him most wasn't the data. It was the quiet between them, the unspoken permission to exist side by side. He wanted to step closer, but he remembered the code: never interfere, never feed, never touch. Observation only. Respect the distance. When rain returned, the wolves retreated into the trees. Ethan followed at a careful span, marking landmarks as he went. The forest swallowed sound. Moss muffled every step. Through the mist, he glimpsed the pack again, settling near a shallow cave at the base of a cliff. The pup lingered at the entrance, licking its paw. Ethan saw the wound more clearly now, raw, crusted with sand. His chest tightened. He had antiseptic and gauze in his field kit, the same that had saved his own hand from infection after the fall. He hesitated. Intervening meant breaking protocol. But watching an injured animal limp in pain felt worse. He moved slowly, keeping his posture low, eyes averted. The alpha barked a warning. The pup turned. Ethan knelt, set the kit on the ground, and slid it forward. He didn't reach. He simply waited. Minutes dragged. Then, to his astonishment, the pup limped forward, sniffed the open bag, and stepped back again. The alpha came close, inspected the stranger's offering, and after a long pause relaxed her stance. Ethan interpreted it as tolerance, not trust, but absence of threat. He whispered, "That's all right. You take what you need." The moment passed. The wolves retreated deeper into the forest, the pup glancing back once before disappearing behind ferns. Ethan remained kneeling until their footfalls faded. Then he gathered his gear, heart still racing. That night back at camp, he reviewed the footage. The screen glowed in the dark tent, showing the impossible: a wolf's paw striking water like a fisherman's hand. A salmon caught mid-leap. The pup's clumsy attempts to imitate. He replayed the scene again and again until the battery died. In his field notes, he wrote, "Behavior observed intentional fishing." Evidence suggests cooperative technique. Emotional reaction. Awe bordering on reverence. He stopped, stared at the last line, and added another. "They saved me once. Today, they let me stay." Outside, the wind carried a low, mournful howl from the direction of the cliffs. Ethan stepped out into the cold, scanning the darkness. The howl repeated longer this time, layered with others, a harmony that filled the valley. He realized it wasn't just communication. It was presence, a way of saying, "We are here, and so are you." He whispered back almost without thinking, "I hear you." And for the first time since he'd nearly drowned, Ethan Carter didn't feel alone. Days turned into a quiet rhythm, the kind that only wilderness could create. Each dawn, the fog would lift from the valley, like a curtain revealing the same river, the same silver tide. Ethan Carter had learned to move as silently as the wolves he studied. He no longer thought of them as subjects. They were neighbors. At first, the pack avoided him, distant shapes between trunks, reflections in shallow water. But gradually, boundaries shifted. He kept his distance, respected their space, and in return, they tolerated his presence. The wolf pup was the bridge between worlds. Every morning, Ethan would find its small paw prints near the riverbank, sometimes beside his own boot tracks from the night before. The pup watched him with unblinking curiosity, often appearing at the edge of camp to sniff his camera tripod or chase the reflection of the lens when sunlight hit the glass. He named it quietly in his journal, Delta, for the place where river meets sea, where everything begins and ends. Delta's leg wound still hadn't healed. Ethan debated for days whether to help again. He knew the law wildlife must remain wild, but compassion rarely reads rulebooks. One morning, as the pack hunted upstream, Delta lingered behind, limping. Ethan crouched nearby, opened his field kit, and poured a small measure of antiseptic over a gauze pad. He didn't move closer. He just left it on the rock between them. The pup sniffed. The pad sneezed, then astonishingly pressed its leg against the cool surface, mimicking what it had seen him do for himself days earlier. Ethan bit his lip to keep from gasping. The animal wasn't following instinct. It was remembering. He wrote later, "Observation 27 learned behavior via visual mimicry." Wolves may understand intentional care, but what stayed with him wasn't the scientific marvel. It was the look in those amber eyes, curious, cautious, and utterly alive. That night, the weather changed. A cold front swept down from the north, turning rain into sleet. Ethan's tent shuddered under the wind. He layered on every piece of dry clothing he had huddled with his notebook and tried to keep the fire alive. Through the storm, he heard the distant howls again, short, fragmented, like questions thrown into the dark. Then came another sound, whining. Close. He unzipped the tent. Delta stood outside, soaked, trembling. Ethan froze. Every instinct screamed not to interfere, but leaving it out there meant death. He whispered, "Okay, just for the night." He stepped back, letting the pup choose. Delta hesitated, sniffed the air, then crawled inside. It lay near the entrance, wary but not afraid. Ethan turned off his headlamp and let darkness settle. The smell of wet fur and salt filled the air. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a visitor. By dawn, the storm had broken. The pup was gone, only muddy paw prints left behind. The following days blurred into work. Ethan repaired camera traps, logged observations, and filmed hours of footage showing the wolves' extraordinary fishing tactics, timing their strikes with the surge of tide, caching uneaten fish for later even trading positions like practiced teams. Delta was growing fast, stronger, braver. It no longer limped. Ethan often spotted it leaping between rocks, chasing waves. Sometimes it disappeared for hours, then reappeared with a salmon tail clamped proudly in its jaws. But coexistence with wildness always demands a price. One afternoon, as he filmed from the opposite bank, a ranger boat appeared downriver, the Department of Fish and Game. 2 officers waved him over. "Carter, we've been tracking your beacon." One shouted, "You're out of the permitted zone." Ethan's chest tightened. "Just observing," he said. The officer frowned. "Observation's fine, but there've been reports of wolves too close to camp. You're interfering with their range." He wanted to protest, to explain that they were the ones choosing the proximity, not him, but he stayed silent. The wolves had given him something fragile: trust. He wouldn't betray that by turning it into paperwork. When the boat left, Ethan crossed back toward the forest, nerves still burning. The pack had vanished. Only Delta remained, watching him from the tree line. He whispered, "Don't worry, little one. I won't let them drive you away." That night, his camera caught something new. 2 strange figures near the river, local trappers, dragging nets illegally through the shallows. Ethan didn't confront them, but he knew the danger. Where traps appear, wolves get blamed. The next morning proved it. He found a snare hidden near a fish cache, a wire glinting in the dew. He dismantled it quietly, marking the coordinates in his notebook. The line between study and protection was blurring. "I came to learn about wolves. I stayed because I couldn't stand to see them harmed." Later that day, he saw the pack again, clustered near the estuary. They seemed restless, pacing, sniffing, alert. A storm was coming, not of weather, but of conflict. As the sky turned red with sunset, Delta approached him openly for the first time. It stopped only a few feet away, tail low, head tilted. Ethan didn't move. For a heartbeat, the world held still, man and wolf sharing the same breath. Then Delta did something he'd never seen before. It dropped a salmon at his feet. Ethan stared, overwhelmed. It wasn't offering food. It was sharing success, the purest sign of connection in the wild. He knelt, whispered softly, "Thank you." The pup barked once, spun, and vanished back into the trees. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He wrote by the dim light of his tablet. Observation 42, subject wolf pup exhibits gift-sharing behavior. Possible social reciprocity. Emotional response, indescribable. He stopped typing, looked up at the stars faintly visible through the cloud gaps, and thought of how small he was in this vast, breathing world. The wolves were no longer myths or threats. They were teachers, showing him what it meant to belong without possession. He didn't know it yet, but the next storm would test that bond more brutally than either of them could imagine. Trust, once given by the wild, is never permanent. You must earn it again with every storm. The first sign came as silence. The forest stilled. The wind paused as if the world itself held its breath. Then a distant roll of thunder, deep and steady like a warning from the sea. Ethan Carter looked up from his field notes, feeling the pressure shift. The air grew heavy, the smell of ozone sharp as metal. Out over the horizon, the ocean turned black. He had spent enough seasons outdoors to recognize what was coming. Not a simple rainstorm, but a full coastal tempest, the kind that ripped trees out by their roots. He checked his gear, securing cameras and samples in waterproof cases. But something in him resisted the idea of retreating to base camp. The wolves were still near the river. He couldn't leave them. He moved fast, following the familiar path through the alder thickets toward the estuary. The first drops fell large, cold, and scattered like thrown stones. By the time he reached the shoreline, rain had turned into sheets. The pack was there. He saw them gathered near a fallen log, pacing restlessly. The alpha barked short commands, her ears pinned back. The juveniles darted back and forth, uncertain. Delta stood apart, whining softly. Ethan watched as they began to climb toward higher ground, their instincts perfectly tuned to survival. He started after them, but the mud made every step a struggle. Wind tore through the trees, bending them until they moaned like living things. Then came the flash lightning, splitting the sky blinding white. It hit somewhere upriver. The sound arrived a second later, a concussion that rattled his bones. "Move, Ethan," he muttered, gripping his pack. But before he could climb, a sharp cry cut through the wind. Delta. The pup had slipped, one paw caught between two slick stones near the river's edge. The current was rising fast, turning brown with silt and debris. Ethan dropped his bag and ran. The water was up to his knees before he reached the pup. Delta struggled, panic in its eyes. "Hold still," he gasped. "I've got you." He pried at the rocks, his fingers going numb from the cold. A surge hit, nearly knocking him over. Delta yelped, and he lost grip for a moment before finally freeing the leg. The pup stumbled, then pressed against him instinctively, seeking warmth. Thunder boomed again, closer. Trees cracked in the distance. Ethan looked up the slope. The alpha and two wolves were watching, waiting. The current was rising too fast. He couldn't carry the pup alone. "Come on," he said, urging Delta forward, but the mud sucked at his boots, pulling him down. The wolves above barked urgently, circling. Then, to his disbelief, one slid down toward him. The alpha herself, her fur whipped by rain. She bit into the pup's scruff and turned uphill. Ethan followed, slipping, crawling, pushing with every ounce of strength left. Together, man and wolf climbed through the storm. At the ridgeline, they reached a shallow cave. The rest of the pack huddled inside, tails curled tight, eyes wide. Ethan collapsed near the entrance, lungs burning. The alpha dropped Delta gently beside him, then turned toward the storm, standing guard like a sentinel. For hours they waited. Rain poured so hard it blurred the line between earth and sky. Wind screamed through the trees, carrying branches and foam from the sea. Every few minutes, Ethan felt the ground tremble with distant thunder. He pressed his back against the rock wall, shivering uncontrollably. His jacket was soaked through his fingers, pale. He thought of the ranger's warning, "You're too close to them." Maybe he was, but right now, closeness was the only thing keeping them alive. Delta curled near his legs, pressing its small body against his boots for warmth. Ethan hesitated, then placed one trembling hand on its back, just for a moment. The fur was cold but soft, and beneath it, a faint heartbeat. In the middle of chaos, the line between wild and human disappears. There's only life, fragile, stubborn, and shared. By midnight, the storm reached its peak. The river below had swollen beyond its banks, roaring like a creature unleashed. The air stank of salt and uprooted pine. Inside the cave, the wolves shifted restlessly, shaking water from their coats. One of the juveniles whimpered, the alpha nuzzling it quiet. Ethan watched in awe. Even in crisis, their social order held firm: protection, cooperation, endurance. At some point, exhaustion won. He drifted into a half-sleep, haunted by dreams of rushing water and golden eyes. When he woke, dawn was gray and silent. The world outside looked remade: trees, torn down riverbanks, carved open driftwood, piled like bones. But the wolves were alive. One by one, they emerged from the cave, sniffing the air, tails low, but wagging slightly. Delta bounded forward, testing the ground, then turned to Ethan with a quick bark, playful, alive, unbroken. He laughed hoarse. "You made it, little fisherman." Ethan walked to the ridge and looked down at what had been his base camp. It was gone, swept away by the flood. His equipment, his samples, everything. For a moment, despair clawed at him. Months of work vanished. But then he looked at the pack moving below, their fur gleaming with rainlight, their movements synchronized like music. What he'd witnessed wasn't lost data. It was something no instrument could measure. He whispered, "This This is the proof. The alpha paused mid-step and looked back at him as if understanding. Then she raised her muzzle and howled, long, low, resonant. The others joined their voices, weaving into a harmony that rolled across the valley. Ethan stood in the rain, head tilted back, eyes closed, letting the sound fill him. It wasn't a song of victory. It was a declaration: we survived. Nature doesn't protect us or punish us. It tests what we're willing to stand for. Later that day, he followed the pack downriver to where the tide met the sea. The flood had stripped the banks bare, but already the salmon were returning glints of silver beneath the rippling surface. Delta splashed ahead, pouncing with renewed vigor. The pup caught a fish, dropped it, chased another, laughed, or something close to it. Ethan raised his camera, filming through tears he didn't bother to hide. He'd come here to study evolution, but what he found was endurance, the shared instinct to fight for life no matter the form it takes. As the light warmed the coastline, the pack began to move inland. Delta lingered a moment, looking back at him, ears perked, tail still. Ethan nodded once. "Go," he said softly. "You belong out there." Delta gave a short howl, then turned and vanished into the forest with the others. Ethan lowered the camera, breath shaky. The forest swallowed them, leaving only the sound of the tide. He knew what the storm had taken, but he also knew what it had given. A story of survival that no report, no grant, no journal could ever contain. The sea took everything that wasn't necessary and left behind what mattered most. When Ethan Carter returned to civilization, the story had already outrun him. By the time the rescue boat reached Yakutat Harbor, word had spread across radio channels and social media. Biologist claims wolves pulled him from river. The Coast Guard officer who'd found him barely believed it himself. The video clips from his waterproof camera blurred shapes in stormlight gray fur in the current, only deepened the mystery. Within a week, Ethan was sitting in a windowless office at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Across from him, a woman in a government parka flipped through his report with the slow patience of a person who didn't trust a single word. "Mr. Carter," she said at last, "this reads less like science and more like a fairy tale." Ethan met her eyes. "Then maybe science hasn't read enough fairy tales." She didn't smile. "You violated your permit by staying in a restricted research zone. You also engaged in direct contact with wild animals, wolves specifically protected under state conservation law. That's a serious infraction." "I didn't plan it," Ethan replied quietly. "They found me." "That's not how it works," she said. "You're trained to maintain professional distance." He wanted to argue, to tell her about Delta, about the fishing behavior, about the pack's intelligence and cooperation. But the moment he said "they saved me," she'd already written delusional response under trauma in her notes. Sometimes the hardest thing about science isn't discovering the truth. It's convincing others that what you saw was real. After the meeting, he was suspended pending review. His funding was frozen. His footage confiscated for analysis. The night he left Juneau, rain fell again, soft this time, like memory repeating itself. He sat in the motel room, scrolling through headlines on his phone. Half the comments mocked him. The other half worshipped him as some kind of wildlife prophet. Neither version felt true. He whispered to himself, "It was never about me." Weeks passed. Online forums buzzed with theories. Was it staged CGI? Some thought the wolves were trained animals. Others believed it was divine intervention. Ethan stayed silent. The truth belonged to the wolves, and they didn't have Wi-Fi. Then came an email from the university legal board, formal hearing scheduled regarding field protocol violations. He felt the weight of every frame he'd shot, every howl he'd heard. They wanted him to apologize, to recant, to turn a living miracle into an academic error. There are moments when doing the right thing means standing alone in a room full of people who think you've lost your mind. At the hearing, he spoke plainly. "I'm not claiming telepathy or myth," he said. "What I witnessed was learned behavior cooperation across species lines. Those wolves demonstrated awareness, problem-solving, even empathy. Call it instinct if you like, but instinct doesn't drag a man out of a river." The panel stared back unmoved. When they asked for proof, he handed them a small SD card footage he'd backed up before surrendering his gear. On the screen, the video flickered, the alpha wolf hauling Delta from the flood, Delta limping beside Ethan, the pup dropping the fish at his feet. Silence followed. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Then someone said, "Could be coincidence." He almost laughed. Coincidence. The word humans use when something doesn't fit the pattern they prefer. He was cleared of misconduct, but barred from future solo expeditions, pending psychological evaluation. He returned to the coast months later, unofficially. No permit, no camera crew, just a notebook and the kind of faith born from experience. The landscape was both familiar and changed. Trees regrown, tides calmer, silence deeper. He found remnants of his old base camp half buried in sand, a broken tripod, a rusted pot, his name tag from the research program. He smiled faintly. "Guess this is what's left of science," he murmured. At twilight, he walked to the river mouth. The salmon run had begun again, flashes of silver against the dark current. For a long while, he just listened. No motorboats, no voices, just water and wind. Then, faintly from beyond the dunes, a howl. It wasn't imagination. It was real, layered and distant, rising from the same forest where he'd nearly drowned. Another joined it, then another, until the sound rolled like thunder across the valley. He closed his eyes, heart hammering. "You're still here. Nature doesn't ask for our belief. It keeps moving with or without our approval." When he opened his eyes again, a shape moved near the riverbank, small, lean, unmistakable. Delta. The pup, no longer a pup, now stood watching him from the opposite shore. Its fur was darker, its body stronger, but the eyes were the same golden amber. Ethan raised a hand, barely daring to breathe. The wolf tilted its head, then barked once short, familiar, before vanishing into the trees. That single moment undid months of doubt. He didn't need the department's validation anymore. He didn't need funding or fame. All he needed was that sound proof that what he'd seen, what he'd felt was real. The wild doesn't answer to laws or politics. It answers only to truth, and truth always finds its voice. Ethan Carter stayed in Alaska longer than he planned. What began as a field expedition had turned into something else, a quiet promise between him and the wilderness. He wasn't a researcher now. He was a witness. Weeks passed. He didn't see the wolves again, though he felt them everywhere, in paw prints, along the sand, in the rhythm of the tide, in the faint rustle of brush when the wind changed direction. He knew the pack was watching. At night, when he camped near the estuary, he would sometimes hear the soft crunch of paws circling beyond the firelight. A low bark here, a rustle there, nothing threatening, just presence. They remembered him. He could feel it. Wildness doesn't forget kindness. It files it away somewhere deep, not as gratitude, but as recognition. By late August, the salmon run began to fade. The water cooled. Leaves on the spruce tips browned under early frost. The wolves would soon migrate inland for winter. Ethan knew it too. Their time was almost over. He'd been filming quietly again, this time for himself, not for publication. He captured every fragment, Delta catching fish, the alpha leading the pack along the riverbanks, pups wrestling in the mist. The story was whole now. It didn't need his voice, only theirs. Then came the message from the university. A letter from the Wildlife Ethics Committee, neatly worded and cold. You are to cease all unsupervised wildlife activity. Continued field presence without authorization will result in permanent revocation of credentials. He read it twice, folded it, and placed it under a rock beside the campfire. The flames caught the edge and turned the words to ash. He'd made his choice. He wasn't leaving yet, not until he saw them one last time. The final morning came without warning. The air smelled of snow. The sky had that pale clarity that only precedes the first freeze. Ethan woke before sunrise, the faint sound of howling threading through the valley. He followed the sound up river boots crunching frost breath, fogging in the air. The wolves were moving fast, their tracks fresh and straight. They were heading inland toward the mountains. At a clearing where the river split, he saw them. The pack stood across the shallows, half shrouded in mist. The alpha lifted her head, eyes gleaming like molten gold. Beside her was Delta, larger now, stronger, but still carrying the spark of curiosity that had defined it from the beginning. Ethan stepped forward to the edge of the water. He didn't speak. Words didn't belong here. The wolves watched him silently, the air between them heavy with everything unspoken, the rescue, the storm, the nights shared under the same trembling sky. Delta moved first. It trotted to the bank, hesitated, then stepped into the shallows. The cold current swirled around its legs as it crossed halfway. Ethan's throat tightened. He whispered, "It's okay. You don't have to come closer." But Delta did one cautious step after another until only the width of the river separated them. The young wolf stopped, stared up at him, and then, just like months ago, dropped a fish at his feet. A gift. A goodbye. Ethan knelt slowly, tears burning his eyes. He didn't reach out. He only bowed his head, the simplest gesture of respect he knew. The alpha howled once, a low note that trembled through the air. Delta turned, answered softly, then looked back at Ethan one final time before leaping back to the pack. They began to move, silhouettes fading into the white mist rising off the river. Ethan stood there long after they disappeared. The fish still lay at his feet, silver against the dark stones, catching the first light of dawn. Every story of the wild ends the same way, not with possession, but with parting. He left the fish where it was. The river would take it soon enough. Back at camp, he packed what little he had left, his broken camera, his field notes, the SD card holding the only surviving footage of the wolves' fishing ritual. He sealed it in a waterproof case and tucked it into his jacket. Before leaving, he wrote one final note in his journal. "Wolves do not belong to us. We belong to the same story, only different chapters." Then he closed the notebook and placed it inside a hollow log near the estuary, a time capsule for whoever might come after. At the ridge above the sea, he turned one last time. The forest was quiet now, but in his mind he could still hear the echo of howls rolling over the water. He raised his hand in farewell, not to be seen, but to say what words could not. "Thank you for letting me in." The wind rose, carrying the scent of salt and cedar. Somewhere beyond the trees, a single distant howl rose in reply. He smiled. "I'll take that as goodbye. We don't own the wild, we borrow moments from it, and if we're lucky, it remembers us kindly." 3 months after the farewell, the coast was alive again. The storm scars had softened, and life had returned with its quiet stubbornness, sprouts pushing through the mud, salmon schools returning like silver ghosts. Ethan Carter was back, though not as a researcher this time. He was a guest. He had spent the winter teaching at a small community college in Anchorage, sharing lessons on field ethics and wildlife behavior. Most of his students had heard the story already, the viral one half myth, half miracle, but he never spoke of it himself. He just taught them to observe without assumption, to walk into the field with more questions than answers. When spring came, he could no longer stay indoors. He returned to the Alaskan coast with a permit renewed this time, supervised approved official. But deep down, he knew nothing official could ever measure what he'd found. The estuary looked different, yet familiar. The same river, the same wind. He walked the trail to his old campsite, finding the hollow log where he'd hidden his journal. It was still there, damp but intact. He smiled, thumbing through the pages, his handwriting faded, but the words still clear. At the bottom of the valley, he set up a new camera trap. Different purpose this time, not to prove, but to remember. Data is important, but some truths live outside the graph. They breathe, they move, they vanish when you chase them. For days he filmed the river, the tide, the migration. Sometimes he spoke to the camera like an old friend, telling it about Delta and the storm, about what trust had felt like that night in the cave. Locals who'd once mocked him now treated him with a strange respect. They had seen wolves along the shore too, not hunting deer this season, but waiting by the river mouth for salmon. One fisherman told him, "I saw a big one with a scar on its leg. Didn't attack my dog, just watched me and walked off." Ethan knew that scar. He didn't say a word. At night, he sat by the fire and edited his footage, old and new cut together into a quiet film called The Fishing Pack. No voiceover, no commentary, just sound and motion, paws breaking waterlight on fur waves, lapping at stone. He wanted people to see without him telling them what to think. When he finally uploaded the film to the Wildlife Archive Network, he added one caption, "Recorded under Alaskan permit, number B204. No wolves were tamed, fed, or handled. Respect the distance." Within a month, the video spread beyond scientific circles. Teachers used it in classrooms. Documentary producers called. Conservation groups cited it as proof that wolves could adapt in ways never imagined. But Ethan wasn't chasing recognition anymore. He just wanted the wolves safe. Every story the internet tells eventually forgets its source. That's fine. If they remember the wolves, that's enough. Late one evening, as the tide turned and the sky burned pink over the sea, he heard it again. A howl. Faint but clear, rolling from the north ridge. He stood very still, letting the sound wash over him. Then another howl joined it, younger, brighter. He recognized that tone immediately. Delta. His heart lifted. He didn't try to follow it. He just listened, smiling. When the sound faded, he packed his camera for the last time. He would return to the city soon, back to lectures, back to human noise, but this place would stay with him. Before leaving, he walked once more to the river bend where it had all begun. The stones were smooth now, the water clear. He knelt, touching the surface. The cold bit his fingers, but beneath it was something gentle, the pulse of life carrying on indifferent to human noise. I came to study the wild. It studied me instead. And in that reflection, I found something I didn't expect: peace. He stood watching the current carry foam and light downstream to the open ocean. The camera lingered on his face, older, calmer, changed. The final minutes of his film played to an audience in a small theater months later. Scientists, students, fishermen, locals, people who rarely shared the same room, sat in silence as the wolves appeared on screen. No narration, just music and the sound of waves. When the credits rolled, no one clapped at first. Then someone whispered, "I never knew wolves could do that." Ethan smiled quietly from the back row. He didn't need to say anything. The wolves had spoken for themselves. The wild doesn't need us to speak for it. It only needs us to listen long enough to hear its truth. In the end, every story about the wild becomes a story about ourselves. Ethan Carter's footage would go on to be studied in universities, debated in conferences, dissected in documentaries. Some called it evidence of advanced predatory learning. Others saw it as proof of emotional intelligence in wolves. But for Ethan, none of those explanations mattered as much as what it meant to feel seen by the wild and to see it without fear. He learned that the greatest discoveries don't happen under microscopes or in laboratories. They happen in silence, when you stop measuring life and start sharing breath with it. The coastal wolves taught him something that no textbook could capture, that survival isn't only about strength, it's about cooperation. That intelligence isn't measured by tools, but by empathy. And that trust once earned from the wild is the rarest gift a human can receive. He often repeated one sentence in his lectures afterward: the wild doesn't need saving, it needs understanding. Because conservation isn't charity, it's respect. It's the recognition that nature doesn't revolve around us, we revolve within it. He also spoke of Delta not as a myth, but as a teacher. The little wolf pup that had once stood trembling on a rock during a storm had grown into a hunter of the tide, a guardian of the shore. And in that transformation was the real lesson. Wildness given a chance will always heal itself. Ethan's final note in his journal read, "We come into the world believing we must protect nature. But maybe the truth is simpler. We must learn to belong to it." He never returned to the coast again, but the recordings lived on. Thousands of students, researchers, and ordinary people watched the wolves fish hunt, play, and howl under the same sky that had once nearly drowned him. Every time someone saw the film, the same reaction followed: silence first, then wonder. And perhaps that was the real goal all along, to remind people that wonder is not weakness. It is the beginning of respect. The wolves didn't rescue a man that night. They reminded him what being alive means: to reach out, to fight, to care, to remember. The camera fades to black. The last sound, a single howl echoing across the water, neither near